Konjour, amis-tachi, and now I have to re-record the types of cards for Hand of Heroes because I accidentally uploaded one of the failed videos, one of the videos that I did to test recording to just make sure that the audio was all good. So, without further ado, let's get back into the 8 different types of cards. We'll start off with essential cards, talking about Basic Dash over here. Basic Dash is one of the 6 essential cards that you have in your hand. They are in your hand technically, but you can't use them for discarding, you can't use them for finishers, you can't exhaust them. They can never be discarded, they can only be played. They're part of your hand, but they're not considered part of your hand in that regard. They are just the essential actions that every character should be capable of doing, because I didn't want characters existing who just have their hand loaded up with spells and no ability to move or do anything else that lets them function properly as a character in combat. So, Basic Dash. It's one of those 6 cards. Has a range of self, because it affects you. You have to discard one of your cards. Again, it can't be one of the essential cards. It has to be an actual card in your hand to let you move with the quick keyword so you can play a card after this. And it has the Eternal keyword. Eternal is like repeat, so that once you play it, it goes back to your hand at the end of the turn. You can't keep playing this card because it goes back at the end of your turn. So it's not a spammable card, but it is a card you can keep using every turn as long as you have that one card to discard. Those are Eternal cards. We're going into the first actual type of card, the Strikes. So we'll talk about Basic Shot over here. It's from the Archer class, so obviously it requires a ranged weapon. It has a range of medium, 60 feet, and Strikes are your offensive attack cards. They're your mundane attack cards. They're not usually involving magic in any way and primarily rely on your weapon. So it requires a ranged weapon and it deals your weapon damage. Repeat. Very self-explanatory. As it deals your weapon damage, it scales with your weapon. So if you have a magic weapon that deals bonus damage, that bonus damage is applied to this card. The other type of physical weapon attack card is called the Finishers. Now, Finishers are by far my favorite card type in Hand of Heroes. They are very high risk, very high reward. When you play a Finisher, you exhaust other cards in your hand, and that becomes your exile value. For each card you exhaust, increase the exile value by 1. You have to exhaust at least 1 card to play a Finisher, and the more cards you do, the more insane it gets. But since you exhaust the card is removed from your hand. It doesn't come back until you take a rest. So it is high risk, high reward. You use this ultimate technique, but you limit your actions in the future, so you gotta really hope that it'll sway the battle in your favor or that you can subsist on the cards that you have left. So what's Volley do? It's got a range of medium 60 feet, just like Basic Shot. Requires a ranged weapon because it's from the Archer class. It deals weapon plus exile damage. So you exile 2 cards, it deals weapon plus 2 damage. And it has the keyword multi-attack exile. So every card you exile makes 1 extra attack against a different target or the same target. You exile 4 cards, it's weapon plus 4 damage against 4 different targets. That's 16 bonus damage and 3 extra weapon attacks. It's pretty good, but then you've exhausted 4 cards, and that's pretty much more than half your hand. So it's high risk, high reward. You gotta be sure that this is what you want to do. It's not something you just use all willy-nilly, unless you exhaust. Your whole combat plan is to exhaust everything but Basic Shot with Volley, and then just use the rest of Basic Shot the rest of combat. That'll work. That's the strategy, and it's high payoff. But the longer the fight, the worse that option becomes. The third type of card I want to talk about is Support. It's considered the non-magical buff kind of role. We've got 2 examples here. We've got Razor Arrows and Reposition. Both are from the Archer class. Support cards are essentially anything that is non-magical that does some effect that is not a damaging effect. So for example, Razor Arrows here has a range of self, and it gives your next attack plus 2 damage. So the next strike or finisher you use deals plus 2 damage. And it has keyword quick. Again, keyword quick means you don't end your turn once you play it. Reposition, on the other hand, is a different card. It still has a range of self. There are supports that don't have range of stealth that have other targets. I just didn't pull one up because I was lazy and didn't find one in Archer. But it's move refresh. Like basic refresh, it gets your hand back, but this has a move on top of it. So it's strictly better than just regular refresh. Oh, not strictly better, because basic refresh comes back to your hand, whereas this one will be in your discard. It doesn't get your whole hand, because you have to play this card, and as this card resolves, it then goes to your discard as you get everything else back to your hand. So it's still good, but it's not spammable. And those are the support cards. That's basically it for the non-magical side of things. Well, actually, that's not quite true. But we'll talk about spells and cantrips here. And I'll just pull them both up. So cantrips are your non-magical... no, they're not magic. They are definitely magical. They are your magical spells that do not have an associated magic cost, or mana cost. As such, you usually use them to build up to your big casting spells. So for example, here we have Cold Blast. It's a cantrip with a range of 30 feet close. It deals 1d10 cold damage, gives you 1 armor, gain 1 armor for the turn, and charge 1, repeat. So it deals 1d10 cold damage. Your armor increases by 1 for the turn, as the cold kind of makes it a little bit harder to hit. You make your skin tougher. Charge 1, gives you 1 mana, and repeat. Goes back to your hand at the end of turn. As charged, you start with 0 mana at the beginning of each day, and you play cards that give charge that give you 1 mana. You have a maximum mana pool, and that is tied to your ability scores. You can choose which ability score, but it's one of your mental ones. You also have a reserve pool. You can use the reserve pool to augment your spells or use them. It's essentially a bonus amount of charge that you have, and essentially how far in the negative you can go. When you use, let's say you have a reserve of 2 with 0 charge, you could cast this hail spell here for 2, and then you'd have no mana. Your charge pool, your reserve pool would be empty. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this. Let's try this again. Okay, so you have your regular pool of charge, which starts at 0 and is a maximum dependent on either your intelligence or your charisma and some other numbers involved. You also have a reserve pool. This reserve pool starts at full, and you can take mana out of it when you cast spells to use it instead of taking from your actual mana. So if you have insufficient mana, you can still cast the spell, or you can buff a spell up even further by taking out of your reserve pool. Now, your reserve pool does not regenerate. You have to sleep to get it back. So it is not something you just tap into because you want to. It's something you tap into as a last resort or as an emergency. So anyway, spells. We've got Hail here. It's a spell X, so that means it costs anywhere between 1 and infinity mana. It has a range of 30 with a square of 5x. So for each mana you spend into it, you increase the range of the square by 5 feet. So it becomes a 5-foot square at 1, a 10-foot at 2, a 15-foot at 3, and it gets bigger and bigger. The damage on it is 2d6 cold plus X piercing damage. Exhaust. So it deals 2d6 cold damage plus 1 extra piercing damage for every mana you put into it to every target in that AoE, and then exhaust. That means it goes to the exhausted pool, and you can't play it again until you do a rest, so it's a one and done. Now those are spells. There are spells that have strict mana costs, and I think I've talked about that in the first video, what is Hand of Heroes. We've shown cards that have 1 mana cost, 2 mana cost, 3, 4, 5 mana cost, and then there's spells with X. The last type of card that I want to talk about is called the Styles. Styles are an interesting card. They have a long-lasting buff. So once you play them, you get this continual effect until the effect is cleansed. You can always cleanse your own buffs Enemies can also cleanse your buffs. You can cleanse your debuffs. Enemies can cleanse your debuffs if you're being generous. And if you're feeling like being a jerk, you can even cleanse your allies' buffs. If you really want to. I wouldn't recommend it. But anyway, we'll talk about offensive and defensive styles right here. Waba. From the monk class, we have crane style and boar style. Now there's the third type of style called utility style. You can have one of each style active at a time. If you play a second offensive style, or a second defensive style, or a second utility style, you lose the last one. So it's not recommended to have a hand of more than one of each style, because you have a hand of at most 6 cards at basic, and if you have 3 styles, that means you have 3 other cards to do things with, and that's not really a lot to go with. So let's talk about crane style. It's a defensive style. Again, target range of self, because it's a self buff. At the start of turn, dodge. So at the start of your turn, you gain your dodge or your dexterity bonus to your armor. That is useful. It makes you take less damage, and it is something for monks to get around not having armor. Because, monks don't wear armor. Boar style, on the other hand, is an offensive style. It has a range of self. Once again, your punches gain penetrating 3. Quick. So it lets your punches ignore up to 3 points of armor, not including the armor bonus from dodge. Because it's a dodge bonus, not an armor bonus. It's the same, but it's different. Quick. So once again, you play a quick card, you can do other stuff on your turn, because playing a quick doesn't end your turn. The last style is utility styles. These are styles that are kind of weaker than both offensive and defensive styles, but since I didn't want to make you have to choose between styles, because actually in the original version of styles, there was just one type of style, and you would have to choose between offensive and defensive, and then stuff like monkey style fell to the wayside because it was not nearly as good as penetrating 3 or dodging every turn. So I made the 3 different styles so that way we could put weaker stuff in here, and the weaker stuff could still be considered an option in some cases. So monkey style, it's a utility style. At the start of your turn, step, quick. We've already talked about quick. Start of turn effects, really self-explanatory. Step means that you move 5 feet. So monkey style just gives you a little bit of extra movement each turn, without actually having to do anything. Because you can still step, you can play the basic step, which is also step quick, and boom, you have 10 feet of movement, and you can still do anything else on your turn. It's useful. And those are the 8 types of cards. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next stream or video. Oh, Renara.